Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
Okay, this morning we have Tom Paine with us. He was here, I think, about a year ago, right? Something like that. And he did a wonderful presentation on his family at that time. This morning he's going to talk about his, some very interesting experiences and career issues that are very important to him. He received a BA in architectural sciences from Harvard, a master's in landscape architecture, also from Harvard, and from the Graduate School of Design. He received an MBA from the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and he practiced for 4 decades in the field and focuses on projects that advance environment and community sustainability. He was a principal at Ager, is that how you pronounce that? A Shanghai-based design firm that opened an office in Boston. And in 2014, he co-organized a delegation from Massachusetts to Guangzhou, which is now Canton, he tells me, to celebrate the 230th anniversary of American-Chinese relations. And he also appeared on Chinese television in a series called Maritime Silk Road, and he's written several books in this area too. So he comes highly qualified, and I think he's going to have some really interesting things to tell us today. So, Tom?
Thank you, Marion. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? Well, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this brisk post-Veterans Day morning? Good. So I'm going to talk to you over the next 45 minutes or so about China and America, and in particular its connection to Boston, because we have a long, friendly relationship. But let me just say that I was born the year that Mao Zedong was taking over China. This is 1948. The great dream of his predecessor, Sun Yat-sen, and the nationalist Chinese had been blown off the mainland into Taiwan. And so, as I look back on my life of 70 years, I have lived a quarter of the span, as have maybe some of you, a quarter of the span of our relationship with China. 240 years, well, I've lived a quarter of it. How did that happen? So let me begin back in 1912, when my great aunt, Helen Payne Kimball, found herself in China, taking thousands of photographs of ordinary Chinese people with her husband. There she is on the left, and she came back with these thousands of images, and she was a talented artist, not just a photographer, and she did from one of her photographs this incredible charcoal drawing. This is just one of hundreds of charcoal drawings that she did. So she saw a whole lot of China at the moment that China had ceased to be a dynastic 5,000-year civilization ruled by emperors with the so-called mandate of heaven, and was suddenly on its road to be a government of the people. But she found herself in the right place at the right time in 1912 at a steamship terminal in Shanghai. She's the only person in this group. She's behind the camera, but she's the only one with a camera. Nobody else in this picture has a camera. And who do you think she's 10 feet away from? None other than the recently elected Guo Fu, the father of modern China, Sun Yat-sen. He's tipping his hat to his well-wishers in Western attire because he has been elected the president of China after the Chinese Revolution that he helped to organize. He'd been exposed to the West in several levels. He'd grown up outside in Canton. He'd gone to Hawaii. He became a Western-trained doctor. And he became blown away by having been exposed to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Now, how many of you memorized Lincoln's Gettysburg Address growing up? Yeah. Well, when Sun Yat-sen saw the Gettysburg Address and saw those immortal final lines of it, of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, he was so inspired that he decided that this would encapsulate his vision for the government of modern China, what he calls Sanminjuyi, which is the three principles of the people, by the people, for the people. And he credited it in his writings to Abraham Lincoln. But what's interesting for us here in Boston is to reflect on the fact that Abraham Lincoln himself credited those words, those immortal words in his address, to the rhetoric of a fierce transcendentalist abolitionist Boston preacher named Theodore Parker, shown on the left, who in 1850 at the Melodeon Theater, long gone on Washington Street in Boston, talked about government of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. Well, he was being inclusive. He was considering blacks as included among those people. So he was ahead of history. Anyway, from Theodore Parker to Abraham Lincoln to Sun Yat-sen, what about that? This great idea that takes wing and joins our two countries together. That was Sun Yat-sen's vision for China. Unfortunately, Mao Zedong dashed his dreams, and it retreated to Taiwan, where it survives to this day, and hopefully will return to mainland China. But during the last moment, before Mao Zedong took over China, you can see that postage stamp on the bottom right from the World War II years. That shows Lincoln, Sun Yat-sen on an American postage stamp. And in Taiwan, on the postage stamp on the left, same thing, Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen. So there you are, our two countries linked at a profound level of a vision for government that links our two peoples together. But we're linked together in all kinds of ways, as I found out in my years in China as a landscape architect and working with my young colleagues. And let me just show you a moment. This is at the Old North Bridge. I'm sure some of you have walked down there recently, and you notice that the Old Manse has a plaque that you can describing the Old Manse from the walk to the Old North Bridge, and it talks about Hawthorne and Emerson and so on as having lived there. And look at her face lighting up when she sees this. This is that young woman's first day outside of China in her life. And it turns out that this young woman, who was a colleague in my firm and helped me translate books and so on, she grew up as a kid with no special advantages at all in a hillside in central China in Chongqing. She's not even a Han Chinese. She's a Tujia minority people, a member of a minority group in China. She, at age 15, read Walden. She read Walden as a 15-year-old girl in rural central China. What's with that? She was blown away. But she also saw in Walden something that I had overlooked when I read Walden back in high school, which is Henry David Thoreau is talking about Buddhist and Taoist thought. He's talking about Buddhist and Taoist thought about living in harmony with the environment. That Chinese idea inspired him, Henry David Thoreau, in his vision as the progenitor of the modern environmentalism movement. So again, our two worlds are connected. And there she is. And when I took her to Walden, and she said, we went from there to Walden Pond, and she left an offering on that big pile of stones there next to the Henry David Thoreau's house site. And she said, Henry, she's speaking to Henry David Thoreau, Henry, you don't know me, but I've known you since I was a 15-year-old girl. So it was quite moving to have an ordinary Chinese person connected to our culture. So what are we doing in return? How many of our kids are studying Chinese literature? 0. So what are we going to do about that? Anyway, all over China, as in my travels and in work, I've noticed amazing ways in which, what I say, the Chinese people vote for us. They vote for us in all kinds of ways. For example, a T-shirt with the word liberty on it. Well, what's that all about? Or a motor scooter on just a street in Pan'an in Zhejiang province, just an ordinary little town. There's a motor scooter with the stars and stripes on it. What's that all about? So in other words, they're voting for us. They like what we're doing. In fact, they all want to send their kids to Harvard and MIT. That's how much they hate us. So for me, my journey with China began in the 4th grade. I'm going to take you back to 1958. A 10-year-old kid in the 4th grade. And we're doing a project for all the parents. They're coming in, and we're all dressed up in Chinese costumes. And me, I wonder if you can figure out which one is me. Well, I'll show you. It's this guy here with the coolie hat on and the bare feet, standing behind the guy that's giving the presentation. We're all talking about Chinese culture. You've got sort of nationalist army types and Mandarin emperors. We're all dressed in all these different costumes. But for me, little did I know that I was going to become a landscape architect. I'm just as the peasant. How appropriate. So that's where it began. But in 1958, this is the year when Mao Zedong, who was taken over China in 1949, kicked all the nationalists off to Taiwan, is running China, and things aren't going too well for him. So what does he do? He creates this great leap forward in which about 50 million Chinese people died needlessly under his leadership, under his great helmsmanship. It was a disaster. He was trying to collectivize people, end all private property, get them all living in communes, and the commune part of communism, and to industrialize. None of it worked well. At the same moment in 1958, I don't know if any of you remember in 1958, but for me, I remember the names of these two islands, Kim Moy and Matsu. Kim Moy and Matsu. I wonder if anybody remember those names from back then? Well, yeah, because why? Because we were hearing that maybe there's going to be a war fought over these islands. These two islands off the coast of mainland China that were under the control of the nationalist government that had been kicked off China to Taiwan. It didn't happen, but those names stuck. And fast forward, I'm going to get a chance to visit there later in my presentation as an adult. But first, I have a little growing up to do. I'm a college student in the late 60s. I'm a fortunate guy. I went to Harvard. While my colleagues, my cohorts in China, our generation in China, got deprived of the right to an education at college. Why? Because Mao Zedong came up with an even better idea, the great proletarian cultural revolution, in which the Red Guard, these fiery youths who are following Mao Zedong's great helmsmanship, decided to trash everything, to denounce their parents, to denounce their teachers, to shut down the universities so that nobody got a chance to go to school. Those are the Red Guards on the right there, raising their fists in support of Chairman Mao and down with the four olds and all that bad stuff, the past, how awful all that stuff was, right? Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean in America, what are we kids doing? Well, we're getting to go to college for one thing, and we're protesting the Vietnam War for another. And so there we are raising our fists, not down with the four olds, but down with this ridiculous land war in Asia that we have no business being in. At least that's the way some of us felt about it. And so some of us at Harvard wanted to kick ROTC, which is Reserve Officers Training Corps, off campus. And there was a radical group called the Students for Democratic Society, and they occupied University Hall. Maybe some of you remember those days. Well, I was sympathetic. I was not an SDS member. However, on the morning that the police, for the first time in ever, stormed into Harvard Yard to liberate University Hall from those radical students, on that morning, I found myself so sympathetic that I was standing outside of University Hall here, the preppy guy there with the towel around his neck. That would be me. I'm ready for the tear gas, folks. No tear gas, that had to wait a year for the next round of strikes the next year. But we went on strike and shut down the university, no exams for what? A semester? Well, we got Harvard back the next fall, unlike the poor kids in China. So that's 1969. Well, a couple of years later, I was married, and my dear wife was much smarter than I am, who had gone to Smith and then gotten a degree in moral philosophy from Oxford, applied for a Henry Luce fellowship. Henry Luce, the Henry Luce of Time Life magazine, who had been born in China. His father was a Chinese missionary. And because of the disaster of the Vietnam War, the Henry Luce Fellowship decided to send bright young Americans to Asia so that we would never again be so ignorant about things Asian. And my dear wife, being the smart lady that she is, was one of 15 recipients of the Henry Luce Foundation. And all the recipients who were married, well, their spouses got to go along too. So we went to Asia in the year of our bicentennial, 1976-7. We studied Chinese language. We were ready to go to Taiwan because you couldn't go to mainland China. Nixon had just sent a delegation, Henry Kissinger, to China that would restore normal relations, but it was a few years before ordinary Americans could go to China. So in 1976, we arrived in Hong Kong, about to go to Taiwan, and this is what we saw on our television screen. Mao Zedong had just died, and all the people in China, I'll never forget the image, this is what I saw on the television screen, weeping, mourning over his remains on display in Tiananmen Square in front of the Forbidden City in Beijing. They had no idea what this guy was really like. They considered him a hero. They were devastated that he was gone. And little did they know, did we Westerners know, that the entire world of China was about to change under Deng Xiaoping and go in a very different direction from the way the great helmsman had taken China up to that point. So we couldn't go to mainland China. We went to Taiwan that had not been trashed by the Red Guard. because it was under the control of the nationalist Chinese. And so traditional Chinese folkways, culture survived. I was working as a landscape architect in the Tourism Bureau because this Henry Luce Foundation fellowship is not just go visit and go sightseeing. No, you're placed in a job in your profession in China. Not only my wife, who was placed as a professor in a university in Taipei talking about Chinese and Western philosophy, but placing me as a landscape architect in the Tourism Bureau, where the firm I worked with Boston had a relationship with them quite coincidentally, so it all worked out rather neatly. I was going all over China working on the design of projects, like at the top there you see what looks like the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. It's a replica of that. The owner is on the right. He was kind of a weird guy. He believed that we could have all the world's religions and have a hotel and all get together in this place and have this. And so I was hired to be the landscape architect to provide an appropriate setting for that. I went all over China looking at projects of historic preservation, and I was just blown away by Chinese culture. And at the end of that incredible year, I, as a 28-year-old, had been given so much authority and so much responsibility and was being listened to as a young professional in ways that I didn't get to do here. At the end of that, the leader of the Tourism Bureau is bending over the table, and he's doing what traditional Chinese leaders always do. He's doing calligraphy. And he's writing out a poem in Chinese, almost impromptu, and donating it to me. This is his token of his appreciation for me as a consultant in the Tourism Bureau in Taiwan. I'm the tall guy in the room, the only Westerner in an all-Chinese tourism bureau. On the right there, those are all my young colleagues, two of whom became lifelong friends. They visited me when we were living in Lincoln, Mass. And then, as you'll see, one of them invites me back to Taiwan decades later. But I got to see traditional Chinese culture, incredible architecture going back centuries into the Qing dynasty or before. This is a temple on the right. That's the doorway to a temple. Those are door gods, temple gods, guardians of that temple. It's called the Temple of Five Concubines. So I got to see amazing traditional things, and I always resonated to traditional things being something of a preservationist. While my wife, we studied Chinese language every night, and my wife was teaching philosophy in the daytime, but at night and then on the weekends she took dance lessons, traditional Chinese dance lessons. So my wife, Lynn Sharp Paine, that's my wife's name, Lynn Sharp Paine, that's my wife's name, is on the left, of the left-hand picture. The other woman dressed in traditional Chinese costume is a Chinese-American who could barely speak more Chinese than we could. In the middle is their instructor, a world-renowned or a renowned dancer, a traditional Chinese dancer named Cai Riyue. I'm going to mention her later. So there's my wife on the right doing the traditional Chinese ribbon dance. Not bad work. She's got those ribbons going in complete symmetry like that. That's traditional Chinese dance for you. Meanwhile, because I'm not so good on my feet like that, I decided to study Chinese landscape painting. I'm a landscape architect. So every Sunday morning I would take traditional Chinese landscape painting lessons. And on the left is something that I did in Taiwan. That's my calligraphy. I had a chop with my Chinese name on it. My Chinese name is Pan De Ming, which means pain, bright virtue. So whatever, that's my Chinese name. On the right, that's Chatham Bars. That's from the Chatham Bars Inn. That's this Chinese style, a vision of the New England seascape, done in a Chinese landscape style on Chinese paper with Chinese ink, all the rest of it. So I cherish this traditional Chinese exposure to traditional Chinese culture that goes back millennia. But one thing, at the end of our year in the 1977, we got to travel around surrounding countries, and on a tour just over the Chinese border in northern Thailand, we spent 3 days far from vehicles, far from electricity, just flip-flops on our feet on muddy tracks with water buffaloes, and we spent the night under thatched roofs on mud floor huts in these villages. That's how primitive it was. And while doing that, among the Karen minority tribe, I took the best photograph of my life. I think it's worthy of National Geographic publication. It's the photograph on the left. And imagine my sort of deja vu feeling when 40 years later I'm in China, finally in China, and I see another group, not Karen minority waifs, just regular Chinese folks in Nanjing. For me, I had this sort of deja vu feeling because there's something about the way these people are clinging to each other that just seems so Asian, so wonderful, and I don't see American kids doing that exactly. but it just seemed like there's something about Asia that's different and beautiful, and I want to know more about it. And so that's why I put those two images up there, side by side. Finally got to go to mainland China in 1988, again, because the Henry Luce Foundation had invited my wife, who was assisting them in selecting each year's new crop of scholars to be on this incredible fellowship. And so we went to Beijing because they were dedicating the Henry Luce Pavilion at Beijing University. And because we were doing something special like that, we were hosted by the President of China, Li Xianyan, in the Great Hall of the People. So this is the ceremonial space where all the visiting VIPs get posed for the big group photograph. And there in the back with the mustache and so on, standing tall, is Tom Paine, and my dear wife, who's 5'2", is hidden back there. And in the front, in the middle, is Li Xianyan, who's the President of China at the time. And to his left, or to the left of him, is Hank Luce, Henry Luce Jr. So that was a ceremonial high moment of my first visit to China. We discovered in Beijing a world of just bicycles and buses, but not that many cars, certainly none of the air pollution that was going to wreck the environment in the future. We got to visit the Great Wall of China, and that's me on the left, just playing with the Great Wall of China, pretending to fall off it. And me on the right, with that, finally getting to see the original of that Temple of Heaven that I'd worked on a replica of in Taiwan. So it was an eye-opening experience, but I had no thought that I'd ever go back to China. We were raising kids in Wellesley. I was busy working on my own, and then for large firms, had never thought I'd ever get a chance to go back to China, and then my connection with Asia was over. Except one night while we were watching a rerun of a Frasier episode, the phone rang, and it was my old colleague from the Tourism Bureau in Taiwan, and he said, "Tom, how are you?" And we've been in touch all these years. I sent him our Christmas newsletter and all that stuff. And he said, "Tom, I'm now the Director General of the Tourism Bureau. Can you come back to Taiwan and consult on 21 sites? It would take about a month. Would you like to do it?" I said, "I'd be honored. Are you kidding me?" And so off I went. I thought, as an old guy, in my 40s, I thought, oh, Jesus, I'm too old for Asia. It's a young place. They don't want old people telling them what to do. Wrong. So back I went. And now, this time, I got to see the islands of Kim Moy and Matsu that I heard about back when I was a kid in the 4th grade. Only now, they're not being fought over. These are tourist sites. People fly there and look at the old fortifications as kind of quaint from the good old days when we were fighting each other back in the 1950s and so on. So I was consulting on, that's Kim Moy on the top and Matsu on the lower right, and I went to 21 sites all over the place. I went to a nunnery and talked to an 85-year-old nun about being a Buddhist nun living there, and it was just so moving, I can't tell you. But the most moving place of all was a place called Green Island. Now, how many of you have heard of Robbins Island in Cape Town, where Nelson Mandela was incarcerated, and it's now a tourist destination? This is the same thing for Taiwan. Robbins Island in Cape Town was a political prison site where South African enemies were incarcerated. Same thing for years in Taiwan before it acquired democracy, because its transition from being anti-communist to becoming pro-democratic meant that there was a period of martial law, and where opponents of the power of the government were thrown in jail. So they took me to Green Island, which is now a tourist destination. I made recommendations about it, and I was just blown away by the memorial to those who had been incarcerated at Green Island, and now they're all free. The prison's an open tourist site. And on the right there, you can see a detail of some of the names on the wall. This is like the Vietnam War Memorial, where all the names of the fallen who fought and died in the Vietnam War are memorialized by that Chinese-American architect, Maya Lin. Well, a guy I'd known in Taiwan named Han Baoder was the architect of this similar memorial wall, in which the thousands of names of formerly imprisoned political prisoners were inscribed, and 2 of them in particular had attracted so much attention that they had been smudged with people touching these names, because these are the names of 2 political prisoners who, after they were freed, were elected to be the president and vice president of China, of Taiwan, a democratic Taiwan. Their names were Chen Shui-bian and Annette Lu, a woman who had gone to Harvard Law School. Quite moving. Another person who was incarcerated there was none other than my wife's dance instructor, Tsai Ruyue, who I showed you earlier. She had been a prisoner here. She never talked about it. But when I was looking at who had been incarcerated here, I saw her name on it. I said, oh, I can't believe this. So those days are gone in Taiwan, and there they are, a bastion of hope and liberty on the shore, 100 miles off the coast of mainland China, showing mainland Chinese that, yes, Chinese people can be democratic. They don't have to be under a communist system. Just give it a shot. In 2007, I spent a year in Shanghai as a director of design in a Chinese-based landscape architecture firm. I was the only American in the place, basically Chinese, 70 people, an office in Beijing, and I opened the office in Boston. But in that incredible year, living in Shanghai, I got to see the Bund, which is where the China Trade died its final death, with Russell and Company's final headquarters there on the Bund. It's the white building on the shorefront there in the lower slide. So history was all around me, but there was no mention of that historical, for me, interesting fact. There was no plaque on the building saying it. I had to research it to find it out. I went all over China, and I was amazed that in spite of all the destruction by the Red Guard and so on, a lot of traditional Chinese culture had survived. My great aunt, were she there today, would recognize that fisherwoman with her cormorants in that boat. She took photographs identical to that back in 1918, and of course it went back hundreds of years, thousands of years before. Or in the top left there, you see an image of a gallery along a canal in a canal town, a water town in southern China. This is an architectural type that doesn't even exist in the West, but imagine a public gallery with apartments, doors on the opposite side of that open walkway, and shop doors, all connected by a common walkway with public benches the entire length, so the community can hang out here on the edge of the waterfront. We don't have any architecture like that. I never even studied it or even heard about it. I was just amazed. Or there's a woman in Chengdu with a woven basket on her back carrying her toddler. I mean, kind of quaint, but there she is, just in the middle of modern China, outside of Starbucks. I went to a World UNESCO Heritage Site. The Chinese are very good at protecting the rights of their minorities now. They allow them to have as many children as they want. All their folkways are being protected. One group is called the Naxi, and this is a matriarchal society. The women rule the roost. The guys just do their bidding. And it's an incredibly picturesque city. It's so picturesque that even non-Naxi, sort of Han Chinese people like to have their vacation houses there and so on. They love this place. But it reminded me, this is like Shangri-La. This is in the foothills of the Himalayas. That in parts of China there is no environmental degradation. It's just the way it always was still. And that gave me hope that these kinds of places are still out there. It's Eastern China that's really environmentally challenged at the moment. But now here we are, it's many years now since Mao Zedong was in charge. And so we've come to the point where entrepreneurs can start selling propaganda posters from the Mao era. And they're collectible, they're kind of fun. In fact, it's almost like these go back to the 1970s, 60s, and so on. It's almost like it's rah, rah, rah. It's like they're singing in an MGM musical about how wonderful China is, and they're all dancing and bursting into song because China is just so wonderful. But that was a sort of propagandistic impulse of this, but it's so, for me, it just reminds me of a Hollywood musical because it's just that real, right? And they're very collectible. So that kind of thing goes on now in China. You can find these things and have that kind of perspective on a former era. But there are other things that give you pause. Here you see an American flag being used by a Chinese tour group guide, tour leader, in Tiananmen Square outside of the Forbidden City, and directly under the American flag in the distance, outside the Forbidden City, you can see that good old Chairman Mao, his portrait is still up after all these years. Nowadays they say in China, 50% of what he did was not so good, and the other 50% is good. So it's not 100% anymore. So they're kind of getting there. But basically, the juxtaposition of these two images, Mao Zedong and the American flag, what does that say about China? It's kind of like they're voting for us again in strange ways that maybe they don't even realize. Now you're probably asking yourself, what's this yellow thing here? Why is this photograph so yellow? It's not because I'm a bad photographer, it's because I'm in the middle of a dust storm. This is when the Gobi Desert gets angry and starts blowing its goods all over Beijing. And so I ask myself when I visit Beijing, well, how can the capital, the political nerve center of the world's aspiring second greatest superpower, continue to operate efficiently in an environment that you can't even trust in terms of being free of dust storms? I mean, is this good? Does this make sense? It just gives you pause. But then there are more literally environmental degradations that are self-inflicted wounds. On the left, a little sort of architectural overreach, I would say. Why are we doing this? But on the right, you're looking at a lake that used to be drinkable, but not so much anymore in Chengdu. It's a large lake there. You're just seeing algae and that kind of sign of environmental degradation due to overuse of fertilizer and so on and so forth. So you can't drink water in China. You have to boil it. So there's a long way to go before the Chinese environment is going to be even close to what we take for granted here in America. I opened the Boston office. In 2011, we had gone after a project in Taiwan. We won, this is a competition. We won the competition, and it was my honor to go back to Taiwan to receive this award on behalf of the Boston office at Ager. And what I found was that I was not going to give my speech in English, and I was not going to give it in pidgin Chinese. I needed help, but I wanted my speech to be spot on perfect. So a Taiwanese colleague in Shanghai, from Taiwan, but in Shanghai with me, said, "Tom, I'll be glad to help you." And so I had my script. It was perfect, and I had to throw up a picture of me from back in the day. I said, here I am, an old dude now, but this is where my career in Asia began, and I am so grateful, and it is such a joy for me to be back here receiving this award. This is an award for sustainable design, creating a big public park that was going to be resilient in the face of sea level rise, of environmental challenges, and not consume any non-renewable resources and all those other sustainable goals that we as designers feel duty-bound to promote as we work around the world, but especially in Asia. So my focus then turned to creating a book, a kind of a manual of best practices. And I went around China and I made friends in public parks. Here's a guy who I had fun talking to in a park in Shanghai. But I decided to put together this book and do it bilingually. And it's called Cities with Heart. Cities with Heart. And it's bilingual. So side by side in this book is a column of Chinese text, a column of English text, but I wanted to give best practices, give examples throughout history around the world as to how all the cities in China could use their precious resources to advance the life of their people, to be cities that had heart. But I use the word heart also to mean like the center of the city, the heart of the city, in the middle of the city. Those parks have to be great, but the city has to have heart to provide all of its residents access to public open space, because there are about 100 cities, 150 cities in China with over 1 million population that you've never heard of, that I don't even know. These are crowded places. People don't have gardens out back. They don't live in Wellesley for even close to that. When they go to work, they're working in a cubicle. They have no open space. It's going to be insane. They're not going to be well unless they have access to public open space, and that's what my book was focusing on. And so that came out, and I went on a book tour. And on the cover of this book, that's sold in China, published in Beijing, that's Central Park, right? Everybody recognizes that? That's Central Park. Designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. Well, he's a household word in China. They have people's parks in China. That was the language that Olmsted himself used. But what nobody realizes, even in my profession and in China, was that Olmsted, long before he became a landscape architect, went to China as a common sailor in 1843. And he went to Guangzhou, to Canton, and he snuck out into the city, and he found that everybody was very friendly towards him. And he came back with this, and he used this word, civility. He learned something new in China. People had civility, and he said that helped form his thinking about public parks. And so when he went to England and learned even much more, he came back, created parks for the people, where people from all walks of life could be together in public space and learn civility from each other, form a community. So China partially inspired Olmsted, of all people, with this grand idea that then migrated back to China for their people's parks that came in the 20th century under the communists. So I want to now throw in a little of the overarching history of American-Chinese relations and focusing on Boston because that's what I promised to do. But I'm going to keep it very short and sweet. 1765, fireworks. Well, fireworks, this is one of the great Chinese inventions. There are 4 great Chinese inventions, and gunpowder was one of them. As early as 1765, we had fireworks. And John Hancock, when he's celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act with the Sons of Liberty, and he's got the big house on top of Beacon Hill, on the upper, you can see where Beacon Hill is, at the beacon on Beacon Hill back in the day, celebrates with fireworks. So I just added the fireworks to show you what it might have looked like. Fireworks on Boston Common. That's probably the first documented instance of a Chinese invention, a Chinese innovation benefiting life in America. But also, as early as the 1760s, luxury goods like silk are already in evidence. And this is a picture of an ancestor of mine that I saw black and whites of growing up. It's a remarkable, you think it's an oil painting. No, it's a pastel, and it's by John Singleton Copley. But this shimmering garment on Jonathan Jackson, who was a trader from Newburyport, I finally realized that is Chinese silk. So as early as 1760s, we've got luxury goods coming from China, already benefiting us, but not by way of American traders like this guy would have loved to have done. No, the British have a monopoly on that trade as long as they're running the colonies in America. But that's about to change. But anyway, there's a thing called the Boston Tea Party, which has something to do with that. They were drinking tea since the late 17th century, and they were importing Chinese export porcelain teacups and teapots. So that trade was already in place when the magic moment came, when the British finally had to say goodbye. You win, we're out of here, you're America now. And without any hesitation at all, America launched a ship to go to China. This is 1784. On Washington's birthday, in fact, leaves New York Harbor. This is a Boston-built ship called the Empress of China. Goes to Canton, and that is the first direct American-Chinese contact. Finally, we can trade on our own account, get more tea, get more porcelain, get more silk over here, bring over sea otter pelts, bring over ginseng, and all the rest of it in exchange in 1784. On that ship was a Boston-born guy named Samuel Shaw. This is the great uncle of Robert Gould Shaw, whose statue, Robert Gould Shaw, across from the State House. There was China trade money in their family fortunes. This guy, who died young, became the first envoy, first official envoy to China. He was also at Washington's side when he gave his farewell address and talked about how Washington had grown old in the service of his country and also grown blind, and then pulled out his spectacles to give his speech. And that's recorded by Samuel Shaw before he goes off to China. So he has an interesting story to tell himself. Beginning with him, the China trade is launched, and Boston soon emerges as the leader. And there are names like Thomas H. Perkins, the Perkins Institute Perkins, the Forbeses and Milton, and an unknown person who happened to be a forebear of mine named John Bryant, who I grew up seeing this portrait in my grandmother's living room on Sunday lunches and stuff like that. And I thought, well, he's an interesting guy. I wonder who he is. Well, I learned that he had run a company named Bryant and Sturgis, but full stop. What's Bryant and Sturgis all about? Much later, I found out that Bryant and Sturgis is the least well-known major China trading company in America, and I read that they were responsible for more than half of the trade, dollar volume coming from China back to the eastern seaports. So that's who he was. And nobody in my family knew that story. I found it out, and I was just amazed. He's a guy who at 15 years old, his family has too many mouths to feed. He's the eldest. With 15 cents in his pocket, he trudges 90 miles from Springfield, Mass. To Boston and gets a job in a bookstore. 2 years later, he's on a ship, and he's going to work his way up. And by 1809, he's on a boat to China as a so-called supercargo. And he keeps his logbook, and I was stunned to find that his handwriting, that's his handwriting across the top, on every single page of his logbook, on his one trip to China on a ship that is aptly named the Mandarin. How cool is that? So he's going to China on a ship named the Mandarin, and he's keeping this diary with flawless penmanship. Not bad for a guy that didn't get to go to college. And on this particular day, he's writing not only horizontally but vertically, because a lot happened on this particular day. Because this is a day that he's in a fleet with 5 other ships coming from Boston, another of which is going to be his future lifelong business partner, when in the middle of a raging, howling thunderstorm, they're attacked by Chinese pirates, the so-called ladrones, led by this infamous leader named Aputse. And there's cannon fire, and there's chases, and there's just hell to pay, but they make it through. And eventually Aputse gets caught, and he gets executed, and it's brutal. But this is the most famous moment. It's recorded by the Forbeses. I had no idea that my ancestor was there at that same moment. I read about it years before, and then I realized, oh my God, my ancestor was there too, and he's writing about it in his logbook. This is amazing. But they got safely to Canton, Guangzhou. This is what it looked like in that era in 1809. This is done 1800. This is at the Peabody Essex Museum. You can go see it for yourself. In the foreground, that row of buildings is called the 13 Factories. Not that they manufactured anything. This is where the factors lived when they're doing the trade with the Chinese. They're unloading those vessels that are downriver from here, and they're loading up, and they're on a handshake. They're doing business here in the middle of Guangzhou, then called Canton. In the background, you'll see a pagoda, and on the upper right corner, you'll see a kind of square-shaped building. Those 2 buildings still survive. I saw them. In fact, I stayed at a hotel near that pagoda when I went there in 2014, which I'll get to. But they did business with this gentleman. How many of you have ever had Huqua tea? Well, Huqua is a kind of tea that is offered, actually in Boston, has been offered for years, named for this guy who was the go-to trader guy, the opposite number of our traders in Canton. He was licensed to do business by the Chinese government with these upstart Americans coming into Guangzhou. On a handshake. He became a mentor for one of the Forbeses, Robert Bennett Forbes, who lived in the Forbes House Museum in Milton. They love this guy. This portrait is in the Forbes House Museum. That's how much they loved him. And he made them a lot of money, and he at that time was the richest man in the world. His real name was Wu Bingjian. He had a big garden in Canton, and he lived into 1843. And he did business, so much business with them, and so successfully, that he gave $1 million to the Forbeses and said, take it to America and invest it in America. So by 1838 or so, $1 million from this guy comes from China and is invested in America. And guess what he invests in? American railroads. So he's the first Chinese investor in America. So Bryan and Sturgis do rather well for themselves, also working with Huqua. Here they are in their later years. Bryan on the left, Sturgis, his partner on the right, who was a sea captain. Same backstory, you know, he had to leave home as a 15-year-old, had to make ends meet for his family who were counting on him to make some money. And these guys became lifelong business partners, forming a partnership in 1810, opening a storefront on Exchange Place right off of State Street in downtown Boston, selling all that silk and tea and so on. They go on to have 60 to 100 different ships. They're all over the planet, basically, in the Americas, in Europe, everywhere, trading on the Pacific Northwest with sea otter pelts. And Bill Sturgis is by far the more colorful of the two. But they themselves took their earnings from that trade and invested in American infrastructure. They become early investors in railroads themselves. In 1831, that's early for railroads. Bryan Sturgis are charter members, they're incorporators of the Boston and Providence Railroad, which had an aqueduct in a place called Canton, Mass. This is the first American city named for that other canton, of which there's about 15 others across the country. This is the first. So there's always been the connection has always been there in the background. We kind of take it for granted. But here's a wonderful image when they built their aqueduct over the Neponset River there, near the Paul Revere's foundry and so on. It's a historic spot. The aqueduct still stands just to symbolize this. But it grows. It goes out further west. They're investing in the Michigan Central Railroad, and the next generation takes it all the way. The Chicago, Burlington, Quincy, the Santa Fe Railroad, all riding ultimately on Chinese money, as depicted in this wonderful Manifest Destiny ? Image, actually called American Progress, which shows the trains crossing the Great Plains, driving out the Native Americans to their discredit, but with the telegraph line following them. There's a Chinese subtext to this, and of course also there's Chinese coolie labor that's building the railroads too. But back in 1848, while all this railroad stuff is unfolding, back in Boston, I grew up learning about this lithograph. This shows the Lake Cochituate Aqueduct Boston water supply and the frog pond. The frog pond used to be the kind of place where the fountain was powered by Lake Cochituate, potable drinking water coming from Framing, Natick, Massachusetts, by aqueduct. Well, in this picture, there's a blue circle you can see there in the lower left. It was pointed out to me about 8 years ago that there is someone who is dressed in Chinese attire, and I've blown him up. He's on the left. He is in a Manchu costume. He's got the pigtail out back. He's got Chinese attire on. It's probably the first representation of a Chinese in American graphics at all. And he's standing about 10 feet from Daniel Webster, the gentleman in the stovepipe hat there, on the left there. So this is how the relationship began. It began with the import and export of materials, and then people, and ultimately ideas that connects our two worlds together. And it goes on. The first Chinese to graduate from an Ivy League school, or any college in America, graduates from Yale in 1854. His name is Yungwing. He marries an American, raises a family here. Before he went to Yale, he went to Monson Academy. And he played baseball, and he went back to China, and he brought many other Chinese to come over to America for their education, because what he realized right away was, we've got problems in China, and they've got ideas here in this new nation. We've got to bring Chinese here to America to bring those ideas back to China. And so it goes, and it continues. That thinking continues to this day. But it began with this gentleman, Yungwing, in the 1850s. But get this. In the American Civil War, I was stunned when I found that Chinese actually put on uniforms, at least for the Union side, and were fighting in the American Civil War. What's that all about? So this is a guy named Corporal Joseph Pierce, obviously not his original name, who's in the 14th Connecticut Regiment, and he's from China. So it's an amazing connection that we just take for granted. So those are some of the highlights that I just wanted to point out that connect us together. So in 2014, a young entrepreneur from Guangzhou approached me and said, I want to organize an event to celebrate the Empress of China, that ship from Boston and New York that went to China in 1784. Well, he wanted to do the 230th anniversary of it, to hold an event in Guangzhou. And he needed someone on our side to co-organize it. And so I got in touch with my connections on Beacon Hill and in Boston City Hall, and we organized a delegation and had a remarkable celebration on August 27th, 2014, which was proclaimed on Beacon Hill, was proclaimed Boston Guangzhou Day. So, and I got on Chinese television talking about the Empress of China, talking about, I mentioned my forebear John Bryant and how one of his sailors had been Richard Henry Dana, who wrote 2 Years Before the Mast. Anybody ever heard of that book, 2 Years Before the Mast? Well, it was a classic and inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and he became a maritime lawyer defending the rights of sailors, having experienced it on the ship of Bryant and Sturgis. And he, as a footnote, he said, listen, they're the best of the bunch. We just got to up the game of all these China traders. So there we are. I was talking about things like that. They were loving these stories in China. There's our delegation sitting in the room in Guangzhou. I'm with a gentleman on the left there named Rob Forbes, who is a descendant of Robert Bennett Forbes, whose mentor had been Huqua. So he was a China trader guy that was on a handshake, would do business with the American traders. This is a descendant of one of the Forbes traders. And I said, in front of the room, I said, it'd just be amazing if we could meet a descendant here in Guangzhou, a descendant of Huqua. I wonder if that could be arranged. I just sort of threw it out there. And wouldn't you know it, a day later they said, yeah, we can get that done. So, and here it is, a descendant of Robert Bennett Forbes, China trader from the 1840s, is shaking hands with a descendant of Huqua, formerly the richest man in the world, who did business on a handshake, for whom a tea sold in America is named, meeting for the first time in Guangzhou. I mean, it was just kind of cool. We were sort of fantasizing. We could do a kind of cross-generational, cross-cultural reality TV show based on the ups and downs of these two families, because there have been challenges on both sides. So we retreated to a Starbucks in Guangzhou, and the descendant of Huqua pulled out his laptop and showed us family images. His family sent people to America to go to school here back in the early 20th century, but of course they lost all their money under the communists. So he's just a regular guy. He works as a civil engineer. He hasn't got any money, none of the family money anymore. But it was just gratifying to see that at this level of connection, our two worlds are interlinked. And I discovered there were historians who are fascinated by the China trade history. And that nettlesome matter of opium, no problem. We can talk about that freely and openly and not point fingers. It was what it was. So, I'm about to wrap up here. Today, you may all be asking the big question. Xi Jinping, we've heard of this guy, right? He's running China. He's the Donald Trump of China, basically. Can he make China great again? He's got this thing called the Chinese dream. So he's trying to rally his troops by saying, our best days lie ahead, we can do this thing, as long as people like me are in charge, we got it covered. So that's his message. Unfortunately, he's got those who are, you might call subversives, the disruptors who are Chinese-born, like the famous artist Ai Weiwei, who some of you may have heard of. Anyway, he's done some things where he's basically asking the questions, well, according to what? I mean, he's basically challenging the Communist Party leadership, which just seems to be, on some level, refusing to give up power and has no plans to do so, and just saying, well, why don't you, come on now, you can do better than that. So that's the big question. Can this work out or not? So the takeaways. My last slide, but except for a couple. The Venn diagram of our worlds, the Chinese world and the American world, like a Venn diagram, these two worlds intersecting, the overlap zone is increasing. I'm optimistic about that. They're sending their kids here to go to Harvard and MIT. They're buying real estate here. The guy that hired me in China, who had worked at Sasaki, a landscape firm in Boston, his one daughter, now goes to Wellesley Middle School and lives here. And he's born in Beijing. So I'm just telling you, it's happening. The Chinese dig deeper into our culture than we do theirs. They're reading Walden. We're not reading Dream of the Red Chamber or any of that. We're just not doing that. Maybe we should. There are many Chinas. It's just such a huge place. It's like there are many Americas, as we now know, right, given the recent contentiousness of it all. And so no elevator speech is going to begin to summarize what China really is. The Communist Party and the Chinese people are two different worlds. The Communist Party is less than 10% of the entire Chinese population are members of the party. Everybody else, they just want to be left alone, make money, leave me alone. I just want to raise my kids and be well educated. The China trade built America, as I've tried to show you. This is a connection that we don't sufficiently appreciate, but that capital made a big difference at a crucial moment. The Chinese people want in. They vote for us in all kinds of ways. They believe in win-win. They don't believe in an I win, you lose formula of how people can be. They believe that we can do well together, side by side. We're not antagonists. So this trade war stuff is something that I think they want to get beyond as quickly as possible. For me, there's no better way to understand America than being overseas. For me, it was being in China, being in Taiwan. For those of you who have spent months outside this country, you know what I'm talking about. It's a good way to have a window from the outside looking back in. And what I learned, at least, was that, Tom, stop the whining. If I had anything to complain about, I was just thinking about, if you'd been born Chinese and putting up with the Cultural Revolution, you would not be as fortunate as you are now by a long shot. And lastly, shared history is alive and can bring us closer together. So let's share our history. So fireworks, Chinese invention over the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty, an enduring international symbol. It was there in the Tiananmen Square democracy uprising in 1989. It got demolished. A lot of those people got killed, but the Statue of Liberty was there. And I was shocked and delighted to find that there was another Statue of Liberty in China that still stands. It's in Guangzhou. It's in the Martyr Memorial Park that was erected for all those people that supported Sun Yat-sen. That symbol, that international symbol, has always been in China, although people just don't know about it, and the Chinese don't really want to talk about it. But there it is. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. We're open for questions now. Anybody have questions?
I apologize for running long, but I'm happy to take questions. And I also just want to point out, I have a couple of things here. This is a copy of Walden that young Chinese colleague read when she was a kid that blew her away. And here's a copy of the book that I wrote in China with the bilingual everything. So anybody who wants to look at this stuff, it's up front here. Okay, any questions?
Questions?
Oh, good. Everybody's speechless. Oh, there's one.
It's a bit ironic that when Europe was stuck in the early Middle Ages, China already had an advanced society. And yet they remained so insular that the West eventually overtook them. So it's kind of ironic that things are turning around now, and maybe they'll be the premier world nation in the near future. No, don't you think that's a curious reversal?
So yes, I think China isolated itself needlessly. I think that's one of your points. While the West continued to progress, China had its 4 great inventions, gunpowder and the compass and paper making, but they go back millennia. Hasn't been known for innovation much since, and that problem continues in their form of education in China. That's why so many young Chinese parents want to send their kids to school in the West, because they understand there's this thing called critical thinking, which is what you learn at liberal arts colleges here in the West. They want their kids to be able to think for themselves so they can become innovators, because the system in China doesn't work like that at all. It's rote memorization, it's not questioning authority, it's not raising your hand and saying, hey, I got a better idea. No, that doesn't happen. Although I talk to my Chinese colleagues and they say there is some movement in the right direction that way. So, but that was a good question. Any other questions?
What you say about the students not being accustomed to speaking up and questioning authority. I've taken some courses, audited some courses at Wellesley College, which is very heavily Asian, and the classes are very quiet because so many of the girls, even as bright as they must be, they're just not used to speaking up.
Yeah, they aren't speaking up. I think but I'm optimistic that they will be. I mean, it's just, cultural change is a long process, and they've been millennia like this. So they will speak up, and they're coming to Wellesley because they know the long tradition of Wellesley in China, going back to Sung Chingling, who was the wife of Chiang Kai-shek, actually. So and I see lots of Chinese walking around the pond at Wellesley College. So it's happening, and I'm optimistic. I think it's good. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. It's very interesting.